I'm ready whenever you are.
Wonderful. We're ready. We're going to admit everyone.
Sure. It's not a bad idea.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Carolina Wheat, Artfare Curator. And tonight, thank you so much for joining us. You're not on the streets protesting or, doing your due diligence in relationship to following this movement of Black Lives Matter. I'm really excited to resume our Thursday series with Artfare, the virtual studio visits. This week, Young Sun Han. Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hi. With a heavy content and history making that's over our shoulders right now, we're here together, ready to have a conversation, and there's no one on the other side of the screen that I would rather have than you, Mr. Young Sun Han. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah, you've certainly been a practicing photographer after receiving your BFA from School of the Art Institute of Chicago, going on doing some practice between that degree and moving to get your MFA at Mason Gross Rutgers, where you're now a lecturer. And you've worked with professional artists over the last few years. You've been based in Brooklyn, and awards, and certainly you've also have some performative work that you've done and secured a lead role in a movie that's presented at the Berlinale 2019 called The Last City. We're really pleased to have you here tonight. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. And, I'm planning to share some work. I have some physical work behind me, but of course, depending on your Wi-Fi connection, it might actually appear better from me sharing my screen. So I'm also going to be sharing my screen tonight. And, Carolina and I were having this discussion of should we continue the series of artist talks this week in light of all the protests and actions that are happening, around us every day. There's multiple events every day that we can all join in on if we are safe and feel comfortable doing so. And so I'm hoping that, this can also be kind of a discussion. It won't necessarily be a straightforward artist talk, but it'll be kind of discursive, and we'll kind of touch on different topics. Feel free for anyone joining us to ask questions in the chat and interrupt, because I'm also really curious to hear from other people and sort of what is our role right now as people who are artists, creators, or if you're not an artist, maybe you have some other platform as a teacher or just a member of your community, and how do we each find a way to take part? And it's never easy being maybe the first person to, go and try to sort of continue a series when there's been an interruption, but we thought it was important to just have an open conversation. And since some of my practice and my work touches on, social movements, looking at history, as well as news in our present moment, there's some nice overlaps there. And so I'll talk about a little bit of my background in terms of how activism and an awareness of social movements have informed both my work, but just kind of my being and my community. I don't know if you have any thoughts to add to that, Carolina.
Well, I'm really glad you captured, the essence of why we thought it was important to engage in a conversation, because I think your work is so relevant, Young. Besides having a socio-political practice within your own identity in relationship to queerness and being Asian, your family's fleeing North Korea, and there's a lot going on right now with race and identity and how we can become better. And I'm wondering, where are you right now? I know that you kind of are back and forth between Maine and Brooklyn.
Yes. So right now I'm in my home in Brooklyn. My husband lives in Maine, and so we've been kind of taking turns where I'll quarantine in Maine for a few weeks, come back here to make sure the apartment and my backyard is tended to and things like that. So I'm happy to be in Brooklyn this week. And but I was recently in Bangor, Maine. There was a major protest there because Trump actually arrived to Maine, and Bangor was the airport that he flew into. So I'm going to start my presentation today actually talking about my I guess, history of learning photography in relation to protests. And so I'm going to share some protest imagery because that's something that I'm thinking about a lot right now. And I've been kind of going into my archives as of late. So I'm going to transition to sharing my screen for a moment. Hopefully that works.
Yeah, remind me, so it's 2003, really, when you began taking shots during protests, during the anti-war rallies in Chicago, Illinois, correct?
Yes, that's correct. So I'm sharing my screen right now, and let's go into present mode. So how does that look?
Looks good.
Okay, great. So I just have two images from my very first protest that I attended when I was an undergrad at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. So I started as a freshman, literally a few weeks before 9/11 occurred. So obviously that was a pretty seismic shift for our country, for our culture. And during that time, I was taking my first formal photography classes, and that coincided in Chicago with the anti-war protests that came up in 2003. And so I also happened to be enrolled in an art and activism class. And so in 2003, I was taking a lot of photographs of the protests while also participating. And these are my first two pictures that I took. And the image on the left was sort of this interesting aha moment for me, because you had two people in the streets, one who was pro-war, the other who was anti-war, having this very heated discussion in public space. So there was something interesting about this acknowledgement of the citizens taking over public space to assert their demands, to allow this kind of debate to happen. And even though protests alone don't necessarily create change, it's a way to visibly say, I am against this thing, or there's a problem here. We need to acknowledge something. And as a public, to be visible, to be a physical body in space, to, kind of be, I don't know, put yourself where your words are. So there was something really, I guess, captivating and real about being in the streets and, standing up for something that you believed in. And I'm jumping now quite a bit because I can imagine that a lot of people's first protests as well was during the most recent Women's March that happened all across the country and the world, in particular DC and New York. And so one thing that I do when I'm at protests, I really enjoy taking portraits of people's protest signs because you have all of these individual voices that are feeding into one unifying message on the streets. But then there's also a lot of creativity and humor, pathos, and a kind of a vulnerable sharing that happens as well. So these are some images from the Women's March shortly after Trump's inauguration. And there's different strategies of sharing quotes, right? Appropriating other messages from history, as well as sharing messages that might be tinged with your own identity and your own experience. And there's something just so immediate about a protest sign that I really like as well. So I have this archive of sort of my favorite protest signs. I've made a lot of protest signs over the years as well, and a bunch of those are stored in my storage unit. And I absolutely agree with this sign. For those of you who can see, long live Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
God willing, goddess willing.
And of course, this month we've entered Pride Month. And last year, it was a 50-year anniversary of Stonewall. And we remember as queer people that the Pride movement began as protests, began as a riot. And This is an image of Keenan Carter, who was a survivor of the Orlando Pulse shooting. He gave a really incredible testimony of what it meant to be a survivor, what it meant to be at the intersection of someone who was Black and queer, living in Florida, and also confronting all of these challenges of racism, violence in the queer community. If you go to Reclaim Pride's YouTube page, they have an archive of all of these speeches from last year, which were pretty incredible. And I'm always looking for who's at these protests. What are the different demographics that are represented? Of course, this is very famous Lady Bunny in the middle, the iconic Rollerinas to her left, Kevin Aviance on his right, on her right, who also performed. And these are all long life activists and community icons that we have. And also, part of being visible in the streets, demonstrating, marching, is to sort of say, I'm here, I'm alive, I'm fighting for myself as well as for my community. And so there's a kind of, public performance that happens in space, and it's a kind of affirmation of one's life and one's, right to exist in public space, and not to be afraid, not to be hidden, whether you're a person of color, whether you're queer, historically marginalized and oppressed groups. And when it comes to these photographs, as much as possible, I really like to get people's consent. I want them to know they're being photographed, that they have a say in how they're presenting themselves to the camera. Even though we are all in public space, protests, there's also the phenomenon of doxing that can occur, where people's images are used to track down their personal information. So I always like to make sure that people are okay being photographed. And so these are some images from last year. And I'm going to jump now to an album that I just uploaded to my Facebook, which is of the protest in Bangor, Maine. Now, Bangor is a city or town of 32,000 people. It's over 90% white. And so what I thought was really phenomenal about this showing was that even in this majority white town in a somewhat remote part of Maine, there was this very absolute rebuke of Trump's presence. And so I wanted to document that. And most of the organizers were young women. And so that was really encouraging to see. And again, you have the variety of both humor, kind of personal stories, and also the political messaging.
Young, so much of your work is about personal stories of family, genetics, and legacy, ancestors. Seeing within a lot of these photographs, you do capture the essence, the magnitude, the volume, as well as some personalities within the signs and otherwise. You had mentioned doxing before. Had you thought perhaps while you were uploading this onto your Facebook? I know lately there's been a little controversy in folks walking out of the giant, organization, corporation that, advocate for facial recognition and other things. And I'm noticing a lot of these faces are not blurred out. I'm curious on your thoughts about that and ensuring that privacy and protection is maintained.
Yeah, and I know that now with iPhones, there's an app that you can download that will automatically blur people's faces. Most of the images that I chose to upload, because of the pandemic, most of us are wearing masks and or sunglasses because it was also a sunny day. So the majority of these images, it'd be pretty hard to actually identify people's faces through facial recognition. But again, these photos, especially of the individuals, were taken with consent, and I asked if I could upload them as well. So these were people who were okay with being visible in that way. And oh, I love this. This is Air Force One sort of departing, and then the crowd sort of chasing Trump off the airfield with their signs.
I love it.
And again, there's something about these actions being necessary for people to, mark this point in history and saying, this is not okay, you know, Black Lives Matter, we need to deal with this hundreds of years of oppression. And, you know, it's something that I think because of the pandemic and because of this other kind of strife that's happening, people are becoming not just aware, but there's kind of this simmering frustration that's kind of found a voice and found this energy. So I think it's important for people to be visible, even though maybe you might think, oh, well, this action in the street is not going to do anything. It's still a statement, and it's just, you know, with documentation and with archives, it's a point in history that is recorded, right? So if there aren't any of these visible demonstrations, then there's no visual evidence that that people dissented to what our current moment is about.
Well, not to mention, if there weren't recordings of the brutality and police brutality that's been faced on Black and brown bodies, as well as the documentation of the police brutality against protesting citizens activating their First Amendment rights, then you know, it's just a tip of the iceberg of what actually is going on behind, or that's not behind the camera, right? It's not recorded.
Yeah, and I think the role of photography has changed quite a bit from, you know, when I was making those initial photographs in 2003, when smartphones weren't a thing, when people didn't have digital cameras to the extent that they do today. So the film that was being taken, or the snapshot that were taken back then, that was the evidence. Whereas now we all have, you know, recording devices, and it's ubiquitous. So we can more immediately capture those moments of injustice or, you know, brutality. And I think it helps the movement, you know, in terms of its speed and also response. So I kind of want to jump back in time here now to talk a little bit about why I guess photography became my primary medium. I also work in performance and installation. You know, lately during quarantine, I've actually been doing some watercolors as well, but photography is still my primary medium. And for me, it goes back to these old family photographs. This is from 1948 or so on the right, or sorry, on the left. And then the image next to it is almost 30 years later. And the two differences between these images, one is taken in North Korea with all of the people on the left. And this is my grandfather and his brother. And then this is an image that was taken in North Korea before they fled, right before the breakout of the war in 1950. And so the image to the right are the people who survived, or the people who were able to escape. My grandfather's brother thought the plan was too risky, so he and his wife and their children stayed behind in North Korea. The war started, the borders were sealed, and they were never heard from again. So there was this really incredible story, which you touched on earlier, the story that's being told between these two images. And so the power of storytelling that can occur through photography, the time between the two images and all the different events that would have occurred. There's something about that kind of mystery that always appealed to me in terms of how photographs mark this point in time, and was able to sort of unpeel these stories. And so this was the start of a project where I started to research my grandfather's escape from North Korea along with my uncles and aunts. So my father's side of the family, they're from North Korea. My mother's side is from South Korea. And the story goes that they escaped hidden in a military truck. So this was one iteration of a piece that I made using family photographs and paint, and then also a diagram of a military tank that I had sort of imagined that they would have hidden in to cross over the border. So these are some of the details of that piece.
What is cracked over the canvas, or what type of application are you using? An acrylic and oil, or what's
So that's just acrylic and an acrylic gel medium called Crackle that will expand according to how much water and also according to the pigment that you're using. So it was kind of an effect that I was looking to create, and I found this gel medium that kind of does that, and you can kind of play around with it to get different effects. But I like the way that it sort of obscured the image and referenced the nostalgic quality of the photographs as well.
Absolutely. And I trust they're not the originals, but had you found the negatives or did you print them yourselves or are they just Xerox copies or?
So these are actually the originals. I scanned all of them and have a digital archive, but for me, there was something about the, I guess, originality of the images, the fact that they were the, original photographs kind of taken from North Korea and South Korea. And there, I don't know, there was something about, they just felt like they needed to be integrated, the actual objects themselves. And I use a lot of found objects in my installations also. So I think that was just kind of part of that impulse. But I do have these images in digital forms. I could reproduce them, in actually better quality now.
It is really lovely that the actual physical presence of the original object is part of the wall piece installation.
Yeah, there's
Really,
something about it being kind of like a family heirloom, and integrating that into the installation that I really liked. Um, as I was sort of navigating this history, the I went into a memoir that my grandfather had written about his life in North Korea and the time during Japanese occupation, then the Russian occupation, then the American occupation. And so this was sort of a mind map where I was starting with different original source materials and questions, processing that through research and other related narratives. And then I took a physical journey to South grandfather, our family escaped to create some new images and new materials. And this year also happens to be the 70th year anniversary of the Korean War. So there are some political actions in DC to call for the formal resolution of the Korean War this year. That's been delayed somewhat because of the pandemic. I was initially planning to be in DC to talk to some of our Congress people. There's a lot of local Korea Peace Networks groups that have been organizing to bring this issue to the forefront, but it's been delayed mostly because of the pandemic. And when I went to Korea, part of my focus also focused on another island, which is really full of different kinds of refugee stories. And this is the image on the left is a cave in Jeju Island where they found mass graves during these war atrocities that occurred, with the South Korean government actually killing their own citizens. So there were riots, there were protests, and because South Korea was working in tandem with the American government at the time, there was a fear that the small island off of the peninsula was communist, or more independent than the rest of the country. So the American general at the time gave the South Korean government sort of an order to basically squash the rebellion. And then what ended up happening was massacres of about 10% of the island's population. And only when the island was developing a new airport for tourism reasons did all of these mass graves become uncovered, I believe in 2011. And as a result, the government formally apologized for the first time, even though they said it occurred in 1945. So this might seem like kind of an obscure topic to talk about right now, but I'm thinking about these issues. This, again, is the South Korean government killing their own citizens. And what we're witnessing in the US right now is the brutality of the American government and the militarization of police, violence of police against journalists and other peacefully protesting citizens. So it's really important always to have an awareness of history. So not so that we don't repeat it, but also so that we're aware of the process whereby governments can flex their power against their citizens. So we have to be aware of what's happened, not only in our own country's history, but in other places around the world that might have democracies, so that we can see when something has crossed the line. And I think we've been seeing that at different levels in the American government, at the judicial level, at the legislative level, and certainly the executive level as well.
well, you've been going against the Geneva Convention and throwing tear gas and the armed guards and the batons and all of the things that are happening right now. I mean, that is, again, knowledge that we learned in history, where militant governments and authoritarian governments, even with the Geneva Convention, creates that as a crime of war. And understanding that history now and feeling fueled in this uprising, it is important for us to know our rights and to get out there and make sure that they're heard.
Absolutely. And so now I'm showing you some installation images of the photographs that resulted from both my research and travel to Korea to visit sites where refugees were coming in from North Korea, as well as landscape photographs of Jeju Island, where they also have a refugee crisis right now because the island was a sort of hub for tourism, also for honeymoons. It's kind of, marketed as this like sort of Hawaii destination. And so what the Korean government did was to offer visas to anyone that wanted to come into Jeju Island, basically visa free. So if you wanted to travel to Korea, you could just go straight to Jeju without a visa. And what happened was this was happening during the Syrian-Yemeni war. So hundreds of Syrian and Yemeni refugees came to Jeju Island, and the South Korean government basically freaked out and said, oh, no, we don't want you. We want other tourists. And so they closed off the visa to certain countries that were going through warfare and basically trapping these refugees. So people who have left war-torn countries can't go back. Yet other members of their family can't join them because those visas are restricted. And of course, right now, because of the pandemic, the visas are on hold for everyone. But it created this humanitarian crisis where you have doctors, engineers, teachers who are coming from Syria or Yemen and are unable to find work, and they have to kind of acclimate to their new country. And the irony here is that during the Korean War, Jeju citizens who were fleeing from their government became refugees going to Japan. And so there's this cycle. And again, the awareness of history is so important to understand how we might think about treating refugees, considering the host country where refugees once themselves. This is an installation of a beach in Busan, South Korea, where basically my grandfather and his children arrived, and he worked as a doctor. So he witnessed a lot of ships capsizing on this landscape, and he wrote about it in his memoir. So the installation is a combination of the images along with his personal text that he wrote about witnessing people drowning in the sea. And so it's kind of this conflation of someone's past narrative of, from the 1950s to present day Busan, which has become this sort of beautiful cultural hub.
Young, just go back to that image again, please. I'm really appreciating the triptychs, horizon line, lining up with each other, despite the fact that they're all shots in different locations, as well as the different hues, that are captured. I'm wondering, are those manipulated at all? Or are those straight shots, or did you scan those as well? Are those originals, or are they?
Sure. Yeah, so for any of the photo nerds who are watching, these are all shot on film with medium format camera. And the image in the middle is a double exposure. So it's both an image of the sort of looking out into the sea, but then in this sort of little tourist kiosk where a young Korean teenager is looking at her phone. And then the other two images are both long exposures on film, which I then scan and then output as digital prints.
Thank you. That's very elucidating.
And this diptych is actually the testimony of a woman who survived the Jeju massacre and uprising. So you can kind of see in the text, maybe she wears a camellia flower, a symbol of remembrance for the 30,000 Jejuan lives taken by their own government. So she now, as one of the few survivors, will talk to tourist groups that come into Jeju to tell them what she witnessed. And the image to her right is a landscape of one of the mass graves that were uncovered in her village, where they, tossed all the bodies basically. And people couldn't really speak out about their testimony for many decades because there would be reprisal beatings, you would be blackballed from getting jobs, you would be persecuted by the government. And it's really only after the formal apology from the government in the 2000s have people now felt safe enough to talk about their experience. And they're trying to raise awareness around the Jeju massacre and uprising to become a peace symbol in the way that the Rwandan genocide is a moment in history that we acknowledge as something that we never want to happen again. So this was a moment in history where the government was killing their own people, tried to hide that history, and now that it's out in the open, they've been trying to make it an internationally known history so that we never allow that to happen again.
The sample reviews, TripAdvisor.
Oh, right.
Tell tale to folks that don't study too much history.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because this island is gorgeous. It's like, the land where the dinosaurs used to roam. And so you're taking in these incredible landscapes and these, beautiful scenes. Yet a lot of people don't know about the dark history. And obviously Hawaii has its own dark colonial history as well. And so there's this kind of interesting, mirroring that happens in this particular place with other parts of the world that are, tropical, idyllic, we think of as vacation destinations, but have this really dark history of colonialism. And I'll talk about the image on the left with the fence. That's actually a military naval base that's on Jeju Island as well, that the people have been protesting since it was built for the last 13 or so years. This is a young girl who was on the tour with me, and I love that her name was Jeju because she was actually conceived on the island, even though she's American and is living in Hawaii. But her mother is an international peace activist, and there was something just really poetic about being on Jeju Island with little Jeju, who's sort of this symbol of hope, maybe for how the island's name and history can take on different dimensions. And part of this show, there was an installation room that had some traditional altars and shrines set up, which are typically offered to the dead. And these are just collages of different cell phone pictures that I took while I was on my trip, because I was using both the medium format camera, but then also a cell phone for these more kind of random encounters in the city. And so this little reading room had a lot of different materials that I'd collected, ephemera from both Jeju and other parts of Korea. And as kind of like a daily ritual, I would bring in different kinds of food, tea, alcohol, and those are things you would leave on the table for your ancestors or people who passed away. But this was a way to engage people visiting the gallery. So I would invite people to have coffee with me, to have rice cakes, and I would tell and share stories about this project while we were in this kind of intimate space together.
Young, which gallery was this?
So this was at Mason Gross Galleries in Rutgers University at New Brunswick, New Jersey. So this is from my show in 2019.
And you, as the performance aspect of your practice, sat engaged with the visitor, the participant, the viewer, for the duration of the gallery's hours, or did you host some outside hours? I know that you're a fan of enduring performances
right.
Based on experience.
This wasn't quite that intense. There were a few conversations that I had kind of pre-scheduled, and then other times I would just be present at random hours. I was also there for the opening. And then there was one kind of planned evening that was a little bit more advertised. So now we're looking at an install shot, which is kind of a continuation of that show. This was from this year at the Print Center in Philadelphia. And so you can see kind of a different iteration of the install. And the image above me I'll talk about, I actually have with me physically in Brooklyn right now. Here's that landscape again. This is a piece called Damaged Gametes, which is a collage of different images and map searches that I had collected during my research. The long strip is actually a very famous photograph that I appropriated of student protests in South Korea that led to Korea's democracy from a more militaristic government. And that image is what kind of sparked the student movement as well, was when a young university student was killed during the protests. And then surrounding that image, you have some Google views of North Korea, because I can't go there physically myself. So the way that I explored where my family lived and where they came from was through satellite imagery in Google Maps. And you can see that kind of colorful image in the lower left. That's a bunch of video stills that I collaged together from a roller coaster ride in North Korea. So it's kind of a mix of sources and research that I had left over after I had made all of these more straightforward landscape photographs. And this kind of became more of a, almost like a diaristic collage of the things that I was thinking about, and approaching the material from a more abstract kind of way.
So it's hanging from a dowel
Mhm.
that you fashion, and I'm wondering, the material that you've, is this like organza, and it's a photomechanical process that you've printed through a printer, or did you silk screen stuff, or what's the process and the materials here?
So there are some digital prints on adhesive vinyl, some inkjet prints on different kinds of materials and substrates. And then some of it is mounted to, you can see sort of this radiant foil barrier, and there's also construction scrim. That red piece is silk, sort of from my family's collection. So again, it's kind of combining both found materials and specific.
Got it.
Then this image is again of the naval base. You're technically not allowed to take photographs of it. There's signs everywhere and kind of a barbed wire fence that distances you. But after I had taken this photograph, the two soldiers who are on guard started pointing and yelling at me, but they can't do anything because they're kind of far away in this guard tower and we're separated by a barbed wire fence. But I was thinking about this idea of not being able to photograph this very warlike kind of dystopic structure. So after I made the print, it's about 30 by 42 inches or so, I sandpapered away the base. So the texture is from me physically kind of rubbing away the pigment on the surface of the paper. So you're left with this sort of ghost image of the thing you're not supposed to photograph. And I saw it as kind of like a protest gesture as well of, imagining what the landscape would look like without this beast, I guess, this dystopic architecture is what I call it, sort of settled into the landscape. So it's part of a series that I'm thinking of doing where I've been rubbing away, physical monuments from the actual image. And then this is just a studio shot of the images when I'm thinking about install and kind of laying things out. I'm going to jump over this project for a second. Maybe should I pause for any questions so far? I know I'm kind of going really quickly, throwing a lot of images out there.
That would be great. We have 22 minutes left. If anyone has any questions for Young, for that portion of the body of work that he's presenting. I know this next body of work, Limbo Exchange, is quite exciting and potentially controversial in relationship to the restorative justice that you intended to provide for your the perpetrator.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think let's move on and talk about Limbo Exchange a little bit, and have questions towards the end.
Yeah. So this project, Limbo Exchange, is based on a sort of personal story as well, where shortly after my mom had passed away, I inherited her car, drove it from Chicago to New York, and right before I was about to start grad school, which is where most of this work is coming from, my car was stolen. So the car was stolen for several months. I received a phone call one day and they had recovered the vehicle. And to my surprise, when I picked up the vehicle, it was filled with all of this stuff inside. So, you know, I was kind of speculating maybe the person who stole the car was either living in the car or was moving from one place to another, because they recovered the car in Pennsylvania. And so I started to photograph all of the objects that were left behind, including things like the IDs, you know, personal papers, and in the photographs, the personal information is all sort of censored or blocked out. But I was thinking about these objects as a, you know, an archive of this person, but also a way of building a portrait of the perpetrator. And so I had contacted the detective who was on this case, and I told them very explicitly, I do not want to press charges. I want to make sure that, you know, I can maybe reach out to the person who took these items or took my car and see if I can give all the stuff back, because I don't want to be responsible for it. But I also felt like I didn't want to throw it away. And I had just, you know, gone through the process of deaccessioning, you know, my mother's stuff. And so it was this kind of weird mirror process of having to like document everything and then trying to find a home for it. And so there's also a video where I'm kind of using the different objects kind of in an absurd way. The whole project I approached as sort of like a, I guess, my own kind of personal investigation, I suppose. But what I learned through this process was that the detective said that I actually have no rights, even as a victim of the crime, to say, I don't want to charge the person who stole the vehicle. So when you steal a car, it's an automatic felony, regardless of whether or not the person whose car was stolen wants to press charges or not. And that struck me as really odd that I was left out of this process of why can't we find another way, like an intermediary to put us in touch? And maybe there's, you know, some other kind of justice that can occur that's not based on incarceration. Because, you know, I think once someone goes into the system, you know, how likely is it that they're getting the sort of, you know, treatment or the help or the resources that they need that cause the underlying problem of the crime? So I was kind of asking these questions, and it's still an ongoing thing because I've tried reaching out through multiple avenues. I still have all of their belongings in storage, but it's not something that I've been able to fully connect with the person yet, but I still have their things. And it's been kind of a, yeah, sort of, hence the title Limbo Exchange. I still have all of these items. And here's a little clip of kind of trying on the different objects.
It's a phenomenally complex concept. It brings about many questions in relationship to violation, feeling violated, kind of a eye for an eye, or like a retribution of sorts, or what is fair in relationship to justice, and certainly how you as a victim turn around and exploit the perpetrator almost in a similarly violating way. And I'm wondering if you could potentially address that briefly in your thought process as to so carefully documenting and archiving his objects and shooting it in such a commercial way. I mean, clearly it's very professional. Just kind of skip back and think about the dynamics between both parties.
Yeah, and you know, in a way, I think you know, the project is coming also from somewhat of an emotional place. This feeling of both empathy and revenge, of, you know, feeling like part of the exchange idea that I had was a lot of my personal belongings were also missing from the car once I got the vehicle back, and I had this sort of ideal, you know, moment where maybe we could exchange both of our goods and somehow both walk away, you know, kind of with a handshake saying, okay, well, you know, I feel like I've been wronged, but here's your things. I don't believe that justice, you know, occurs just through imprisonment or through incarceration, but I think it's a project that does ride that moral line, because you know, obviously people who are Black are more likely to be you know, criminalized, or the rate of incarceration amongst people of color, especially brown and Black folk, is higher than if this were maybe a white woman who had taken my car. You know, maybe she would have gotten off with a warning. So there are these kind of ambiguities there. So for me, I've been thinking about it more through the exchange of the objects, but also, yeah, I guess making myself complicit in terms of this exchange as well. So it's a project that's not fully resolved, in the sense that I do hope someday that there's a way for me to get these, you know, materials back to the person, whether they, you know, maybe want them or not. But I would say the most, I guess, valuable things you can kind of see is this clothing rack, where it's like a full garment, or full, what's the word? Wardrobe, thank you, of someone's stuff. So I'm hoping that there's a way someday that these things can be returned.
And one of the ways that you're able to identify that it is a Black man that, or a male identifying Black or African-American man that did take the vehicle, is by way that they left their ID in the car with the name, correct?
Right.
And so you had, you know, some information in relationship to being able to contact the perpetrator without the parole officer. Had you attempted at all?
Yeah, I did try. I sent a letter that I never received any response from, but of course that address that I had is most likely out of date. The person, when I was looking up the record, they did actually go to prison for at least a year, which I was really upset about, because even though it's not my fault that they, you know, that they had to spend time there, I had communicated pretty clearly to the officer on the case that I really did not want them to have to face trial. But again, even though this was sort of my car, you don't have this. It's up to the, I guess, police station, or just, it's an automatic felony, therefore they have to appear in court. And then it put us into this opposition, even though it's someone who I've never met. And so that was also this other kind of strange phenomenon of, you know, being put in an oppositional situation with someone, even if the victim, quote unquote, wants to try to find some other conciliatory, you know, way of resolving the issue. So
right. I think the work too is, you know, each piece is entitled something along the lines like toiletries, or car accessories, and
right.
You know, there's a certain narrative that goes along the images without the human presence, that it connects so well, as you already referenced, to, you know, your mother's passing and having an inventory and archive her memorabilia and her personal belongings, or find a place for it. And then, you know, jumping right to this. But these are the works that are on Artfare right now. Some of these works, correct? They're in a editioned.
Right. These are small editions, and, you know, like many of the other Artfare artists, I wanted to make sure to donate sales, you know, of this work and just anything I have on Artfare right now towards different bail funds. So anything that might sell, whether from this project or other projects that I have on Artfare, would go towards, one of them is an equality bail fund that is specifically helping LGBTQ members. And then the other one is a national bail fund, which is also receiving donations right now to help people get out of jail, and you know, help reunite parents with their kids, things like that. So yeah, that's where I've decided to kind of dedicate that to. I'm going to skip over this just in the interest of time to talk about one last kind of collaborative project. I mentioned that I work in performance as well, and this was participation in a collaboration with the artist Ernesto Pujol, called The Listeners and the Listening School. And this was for the LMCC's sort of performance event at Federal Hall. And there were 12 listeners that trained for a week basically going into public spaces with this badge called listener. And we would basically approach people who are alone and engage them in different conversations about listening. And this kind of came out of the fact that we are in a very divisive time, politically, in terms of identity and race. So this project was an attempt at real vulnerable listening. So asking people, how do we become better listeners in society? And, what are times that you've been a good listener? When are times that you've been a bad listener? And that sort of kind of training led to this moment where we were sitting in Federal Hall and people were able to come in, sit down next to us and tell us anything that was on their mind. And we would just sit there in silence and listen. So it was also a durational piece. There's no documentation of the listeners with people, with strangers, so that it was a completely confidential experience. So this is, these are stills of the performance just before people started coming in to sit next to us and share whatever they wanted. And so, we would hear all sorts of stories that were political, personal, stories of tragedy. Some people who would just sit down and say, I don't have anyone in my life who listens to me, so thank you for this moment. Or others who would just sit down next to us in silence. It was a real interesting process, going out into public spaces in Manhattan and just approaching strangers and just asking them, hey, do you have a moment to talk about listening? And there was no particular agenda. I'm not trying to tell you what to think or what my views are, but I just want to hear how you dialogue with people. And it's a little bit awkward breaking that ice, but once you are able to kind of penetrate, it was amazing the stories that people would tell you. Some would get a little too personal almost, but it just gave me an awareness of how hungry people are to to talk, to share what's going on, but also the difficulties and challenges in listening. And so this project was happening obviously before the pandemic, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot now, both in regards to our isolation that many of us are doing in terms of face-to-face, human interaction, as well as our role as people in our communities talking about racism, and how do you bring up these very painful, very difficult conversations with your colleagues, your coworkers, your family, your friends, people who might have very different views, or people who've maybe never considered what their anti-racist behaviors what their racist or anti-racist actions may be, or how to become a better ally. So I know that we're all, struggling with this right now. We're all, trying to find the entry point into talking about these very difficult issues. And we're all on different sides on this as well. But I kind of wanted to end on that project because it was a real, for me, kind of an optimistic way of learning of how we can listen to each other and, how can we engage with our immediate community. Because that's our platform. It's our friends, it's our coworkers, it's maybe our students, the people that we interact with. And so maybe we don't make huge waves with someone all the way across the world or even in our city, but we all have a platform and we all have to learn how to, speak to that platform, I think.
Mm-hmm. And then within the listening project, and as it likely carries out through your everyday life, is one of my favorite things about your work, Young, is that the work is always about your surroundings, like a rings around your persona. You capture that which is your everyday within your creative process, within your concept, your research, all those things. And I know how politically active you are in relationship to fighting for justice and engaging your congresspeople and getting other people to do the same thing. I'm curious about the the listening project. Did you ever feel threatened, or did you ever get upset, or perhaps feeling like they say vampire energy, or however you want to say, like, how do you combat things that you may have heard that you continued to listen opposed to defend or interject?
So the initial training, we were in conversation with people. So I would actually say that I had more breakthroughs than letdowns. So there was one image that I shared of an older white man who was seated, and I had kind of said, "Hey, sir, we're doing this project about listening, and we're learning how to become better listeners. Do you have a moment to talk?" And he said, "Oh, no, I don't want any of your liberal blah, blah, blah." And I was like, "Oh, this isn't anything political. We're just here to listen." And so he's like, "Okay, well, I have a few minutes." So we started talking, and he, was a Republican voter, and he was talking about how difficult it is to talk to Democrats or to liberal people because we never listen. And so it was an interesting kind of starting point because, of course, in my mind, I felt the opposite was true. It's like, no, but people who are far right or Republican or conservative, they never listen. They're not open-minded. So rather than, pushing back, I just asked, "Oh, why is that? Like, why do you feel like you're not listened to?" And so that kind of melted the ice a little bit. And he, shared his perspective of why he felt like, he wasn't being listened to. And I think right now we're kind of in this moment where there's a lot of calling out that's happening, right? And rightfully so. Like, we should be pointing at institutions, leaders, icons, or people in pop culture that have big platforms that might be doing harm or aren't doing the anti-racist work that they should be. But there's also this idea of calling in. So the people that we know, the people who we have a personal relationship with, rather than putting them on blast on social media, can we approach them as individuals and tell them, "Hey, you said this thing that I think you need to address," or "There's something that you're putting out there that I don't think is right," and have that kind of one-on-one conversation with them. And of course, in person is always the best. But I think, I don't know, it's hard, and the context is important. Who are you talking to? If it's some random stranger on Facebook, you're probably not going to have a meaningful conversation. And I get caught in that too, regardless, because I see something inflammatory and I want to respond because they're maybe my friend's uncle or a friend of a friend of a friend. But more likely, I think in the long term, especially if it's someone in your community. And so this idea of calling in, I think, has a real possibility of creating change. And working through the onion, right? People are really tight in their own mind of, "Oh, well, I can't say Black Lives Matter because all lives matter." And then you have to unpack, well, where are they coming from in saying that? Like, what are the things that they haven't identified at level 1? So maybe we can start thinking about the issues at level 2 and then getting deeper and kind of unpacking that sort of mentality. But it's a difficult conversation, and we're seeing actions right now that are much more direct. We're toppling monuments to slavery. We're seeing the unspoken voices, right, are being exercised right now. So I think it's an exciting time, and I think even though we see a lot of images of maybe riots or looting that's shared through media, much more, and you see this if you're out there in person, if you're out there in the streets, if you're going to demonstrations, the majority of what's happening right now is peaceful protest, maybe civil disobedience, but nothing that's causing harm. If anything, I've been witnessing escalation from the side of police, who are meant to protect and serve citizens, not intimidate and attack them. And these are some controversial views that are being discussed right now, but I think this is a moment that we have to keep pushing that energy forward, because there's a lot of momentum. And because of the pandemic, there's also a lot of people who are economically frustrated, who have time, who aren't working, who are willing to put themselves out there. And this is the largest global movement of our generation. I mean, there have been hundreds, if not thousands, of protests, not only in the US, but in other nations. And in places like Australia or New Zealand, not only are they talking about Black Lives Matter in solidarity with America, but they're examining their own power structures and their own histories of colonialism. So I think it's a really powerful movement that's resonating on multiple levels, and not just in the US.
Yeah, so much what you're saying is, rings true, Young. And just to go back and kind of encapsulate a lot of your work and a lot of what we've kind of went through in this conversation is about documentation. It is about recording. It's about archiving. It's about seeing through the eyes of a camera or a lens, and kind of this idea of proof. Like, there's no proof unless you have a photograph, and I think that so much of us are kind of slaves to that once we hold cameras in our pockets and our personal electronic devices. So, the idea of the experience and how you're documenting your stories, I think, are so relevant. And as we consider false narratives, or as you had mentioned, there's a lot of airtime on, looting and, civil disobedience. However, the fact of the matter is there's a lot more experiences out there that are not recorded, that were, working to fight for the integrity and the justice. One of my favorite things I try to teach my children was always, integrity is what you do when no one's watching. And as we're, wrapping up here, the photograph and our performances in real life and experiences do create fantastic stories. Oh, I'm happy you're pulling this up.
Yes, I want to leave or end the conversation with 2 points. One, if you live in New York, don't forget that we have our state primary on June 23rd, so make sure to vote. Not only are you voting for the delegates for the presidential primary, but there's a lot of down ballot elections as well. So for state senators, depending on where you live, there's a lot of different local elections that are happening, which usually have a more direct impact on you and your immediate community. And then, one thing that I like to kind of share with my students, and just with anyone really, is we always have to be very sensitive and aware of the media that we're sharing. And there's a lot of, nonpartisan sort of media watch groups that will share, that will do an analysis of the news and say, this news source is, somewhat partisan on the liberal side, or this one is partisan on the right-hand side. Usually have factual reporting. These are more out there sources that don't have factual sources or can't prove what they're saying. So whenever people are sharing media, I think it's always helpful to say, where's the media source coming from? How do they rate on these kinds of, independent rankings? And also, who's the author? What is their slant coming into whatever information is being presented? So I think media awareness and understanding how to, break down and analyze our media sources is more important now than ever. So it's always really good for us to be aware of what media we're sharing, as well as, again, reminder to everyone in New York that you want to make sure you get your absentee ballots out or go to your primary polling place this coming election.
Yes, and yet another down. It's 1902. Thank you so much for being here, Young Sun Han, keeping active and the fight real and the resistance bold, and in the best interest of humanity and our environment and all the good things.
Thank you so much for having me, Carolina, and thanks for hosting.
Absolutely, absolutely. Take care, everyone. Peace out. And this will be recorded. Thank you.